In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus. Et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Sancte Pie Quinque.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Pie Decime.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Joseph.
Ora pro nobis.
Patris et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Okay, let's continue this very important study on who was behind the liturgical revolution. The psychologization of the liturgy. So we started here yesterday. Pick it up, Anthony, loud and clear.
It is worth considering that the practical application of depth psychology to the liturgy was logically doomed from the start, because these modern psychological theories offered rival alternatives to the Christian-based psychology, which had existed from the time of the Scriptures, the Desert Fathers, and the doctors of the Church, the saints, and the scholastic philosophers. Pius XII could not have successfully integrated depth psychology into the liturgy for the following reasons. First point, it was conceived in the mind of Carl Jung as a quote-unquote religion of the self, to give free rein to the libido and liberate the human psyche from the restrictions of a rule-bound church, especially in the area of sexual morality. Next point, Jung's ideas on religion were drawn from Gnostic sources, the occult, Eastern mysticism, ancient pagan cults of the earth goddesses, eroticism, medieval alchemy, and various New Age philosophies. Next point, Jung regarded the Mass as simply a figment of the human psyche and attributed its transformative power to a dream experienced by a 3rd century Gnostic alchemist, Zosimos of Panopolis.
Strange, isn't it? Next point. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points.
Jung rejected the idea of a transcendent God and taught people to reject all external authority and search for the God within. Next point. Depth psychology reduced the intellectual faculties to the level of sensation, elevated feelings and emotions as the source of all truth, and led inevitably to a Pentecostal movement and charismatic liturgies. Last point. Needless to say, there would be no place for the traditional Roman Mass with its emphasis on rubrics and objective truth. How anyone could hope to draw spiritually pure waters from such a polluted well is a mystery.
The world invades the church. Gabriel?
We will now consider some of the results of reliance on the expertise of psychologists in the liturgical movement's quest to adapt the liturgy to the mentality of modern man and provide a sense of psychological well-being for the participants. The first casualty of the psychologization of the liturgy is reverence for God. As depth psychology, even in the hands of Catholic practitioners, induces people to turn in upon themselves and seek self-discovery. It follows that only a people-centered liturgy would be considered a suitable medium of worship. Hence the virtual absence of the modern liturgy of exterior signs of reverence in the presence of God, such as kneeling, genuflection, silence, modesty of dress and behavior, etc.
Is there any of this left in the new Mass?
New Masses, it goes case by case. There's churches that are very irreverent, and then some that seem reverent. But yeah, you get it all across the board, all different things.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
As a hedonistic society cannot abide condemnations of the sins of the flesh, references to asceticism or self-mortification or reminders of hell, these two had to be excised from the liturgy because they were deemed incompatible with the psychology of modern man. For the same reason, anything too ornate or smacking of medievalism was similarly dismissed. Archbishop Piero Marini, papal master of ceremonies and formerly Bugnini's personal secretary, later made this point with brutal frankness, quote, "In view of the psychology of modern men and women, for which the mixture of court
etiquette
and religious rites is almost incomprehensible, it was decided that the sort of court life which had hitherto surrounded the Pope during the liturgical celebrations should be done away with."
Effect of depth psychology on religious orders. So yes, so this explains why they changed, partly why they changed all the prayers and took out everything that was not fitting for modern man. And now how they undermine the religious orders. The Assisi Address can be regarded as an invitation and incentive to reconfigure the methods of spiritual formation in the seminaries and religious institutions to include such subjects as psychology and social studies formulated by atheistic thinkers. It is significant that these curricular changes took place in some areas even before Vatican II officially imposed them for the formation of priests. Footnote, the decree on priestly training, Optatum Totius, paragraph 11, specifically urges the study of the newer findings in the area of psychology and sociology. So they pushed these studies, which were just a waste of time and destructive. It is obvious then that Vatican II legitimized changes in this, as in other respects, that had received papal approval in the time of Pius XII. But wherever humanistic psychology replaces spiritual discernment, the psychology of the saints, the result has been disastrous for religious vocations and has produced a situation from which the Church has still not recovered. So in other words, replacing humanistic psychology with the ancient spiritual writers. It brought havoc to Catholic religious orders in the U.S. in the 1960s because it encouraged individual autonomy and promoted the questioning of all authority, thereby challenging institutional hierarchies in their power to command obedience in matters of faith and morals. Every religious order and seminary that had been psychologically engineered underwent a mass exodus of nuns and priests, seeking liberation from their vows. They dug deep into their own psyches and emerged from their introspection with predictable conclusions. They no longer wanted to be bound by rules that prevented them from unleashing their libido. This happened in the first place to the Jesuits and then to the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in California, followed by the Franciscans, the Christian Brothers, and many other men's and women's orders throughout the world. Yes, what a disaster, right? A terrible disaster. And that's this modern psychology garbage. Footnote, two psychologists, Carl Rogers and his associate William Coulson, a Catholic who would later repent of his part in the affair, set up a group therapy program in the 1960s for the nuns of the Immaculate Heart of Mary and their educational establishments. Coulson admitted that he had provoked a crisis of sexual misconduct among the Immaculate Heart of Mary sisters, which destroyed their order. See William Coulson, we overcame their traditions, we overcame their faith. Interview in the Latin Mass, Chronicles of a Catholic Reform, January, February 1994. So these people went in and... So who remembers why Archbishop Lefebvre had to retire from the Holy Ghost Fathers? In the mid-60s, he retired. He retired early because he saw they were implementing Vatican II and everything was being turned upside down. So now the superior couldn't make any real decisions. He had to always get the approval of some board. So he couldn't act as a superior. And then all this modern garbage, modern psychology classes, sociology, started being pushed, emphasized. Depth psychology, a technique designed to modify behavior and alter belief. Anthony.
Liturgists have been exploiting depth psychology in the liturgy for decades on a massive scale. Through the use of psychology, they thought they could reprogram individuals by influencing their subconscious minds, coercing them by stealth into accepting what they wanted them to accept, change the church, and control the future of the liturgy. To add insult to injury, those who refused to be thus coerced and adhered to the traditional liturgy were psychoanalyzed as suffering from a new form of mental disorder. With his recommendation for depth psychology, Pius XII shifted the tectonic plates of the church's liturgical tradition. It may seem to some people a fairly inconsequential action, but, as with tectonic shifts in the geological order, it takes only a move of a few feet to flatten whole cities.
Isn't that something? So Pius XII, again, he made another huge blunder here. And that was giving his backing to this psychological garbage. And it destroyed the priesthood, destroyed the convents. And you put on top of that the new Mass, forget it. So I knew a sister, Sister John Bosco in Quebec. She fled to the SSPX because her superior told her, you have to go to these psychological retreats. And she knew that the sisters who had gone before came out different and liberal and no longer wearing their habits. And some of them just leaving the order. So she knew it was something from the devil. So she refused to go. And she had to basically escape through a window and arrange someone to pick her up. And she fled to Archbishop Lefebvre's priory in Quebec, in Shawinigan back then. And there were many nuns like that. They just had to flee. They just had to leave their order to save their vocation. Otherwise, if they went through these retreats, they browbeat them into submission and then brainwash. So that's what made a lot of priests fall with Vatican II, was you have to obey the bishop. The bishop says it, he calls them in for talks, this is how it's going to be, you have to obey. And that's how they did it in the SSPX. I noticed, because I was in the monastery for 3.5 years, and when I came out in 2002, I noticed towards 2010, 11, and 12 was the revolution in the SSPX. I noticed there was a lot more emphasis on you have to obey the superior. Obedience, obedience, obedience. When, we all studied obedience, and we all know the importance of it. But in the SSPX, we also understood the importance of disobedience to unlawful orders, right? But now they were just emphasizing obedience, 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 without the counter-distinction. And I knew something was shifting. So I knew something was wrong. And then it all made sense when, in 2010, it was clear that Bishop Fillet was open to discussions with modernist Rome. He was talking about, let's make an agreement with Rome. Let's get the ball rolling. And Benedict XVI means well. And he's giving us a helping hand. And he was talking about personal prelature and agreement with Rome and all that stuff. So that's what it was for. So anyway, chapter 11, Palm Sunday, 1956. So this is the first implementation of the changed Holy Week, never touched in over 1,000 years. The cuts. So what are the cuts? Anthony.
We will now look at the manner in which ancient principles of the traditional Holy Week liturgy were sacrificed on the altar of progressivism, and reflect on the tragic fact that Pius XII made this destructive agenda the basis of binding juridical norms for the whole Roman Rite. Night of the Long Knives. This was accomplished on the 16th of November 1955 with the decree Maxima Redemptionis. The members of the Pius XII's Liturgical Commission used the Lynchi strategy.
Footnote, a particularly gruesome and sadistic form of execution used for centuries in China, which is
A slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, rather than a single fatal blow, in their concerted attack on the traditional Holy Week rites. The reformers started by lopping off medieval accretions, whether textual, ritual, or ceremonial, topping and tailing the preparatory and concluding prayers of the Mass, paring to the bone the prayers of blessing, excising most of the scriptural readings, gouging holes here and there in the ancient custom of the Roman Rite, and generally butchering the coherence of the whole. From 1951 to 1955, the Holy Week ceremonies were subjected to cut after brutal cut, none of which was fatal in itself, until they were so attenuated that, like all Lynchi victims, they scarcely resembled their former selves. This was the method by which those who were wielding the knives were attempting to prepare the faithful for the eventual abandonment of the traditional Mass.
okay, important point. Very important point. So all there's people, many priests who will go to death to defend the 1955 Holy Week. But if they're honest and objective, they have to admit the fact that all those changes were there to prepare the faithful to abandon the traditional Mass. They have to admit that. Go on.
It is of the greatest significance that the resulting Holy Week liturgy, which would later be incorporated into the 1962 Missal, was horribly dismembered and mutilated, its beauty disfigured, its dignity assailed, its order and structure wrecked, its own special identity transformed so as to appeal to modern man.
The connection between the Holy Week reforms and Paul VI's new Mass. Gabriel, loud and clear.
Before moving on to examine these cults and all their
Cuts.
Before moving on to examine these cuts and all their gory detail, we must pause to consider that they were merely the prelude to worse atrocities. For what happened to the liturgy in 1969, with the introduction of the Novus Ordo, plumbed new depths of barbarity. The same methods were used, largely by the same people, who operated in the Holy Week reform, but were applied in stages, via the 1962 Missal, to the whole of the Church's liturgy. That this was the intention of the reformers was confirmed by the German liturgist, Monsignor Johannes Wagner.
Footnote, Monsignor Wagner was an influential figure in the post-war German liturgical movement. He later became a member of Pope Paul VI's Concilium and was given the task of directing the work on the new Missal. He was also one of the select few liturgists on the Concilium. What's the Concilium again?
It was the group that
The group that came up with the new Mass.
they all
Studied.
implemented the new Mass.
Yes.
In the group.
And who approved it?
This was Paul VI approved it.
And who was the group? Who was the Concilium before the Concilium?
The
Liturgical movement.
Liturgical movement.
Under?
Pius XII.
Yes. Name some big figures in this movement.
Louis Boyer.
Baudouin.
Louis Boyer, a modernist.
Baudouin.
Lambert Baudouin, a big modernist and communist and socialist. Joseph Jungmann, yes, who despises the Trent, Council of Trent.
Pius Park.
Pius Parsk. Giordani. Yes. Other key collaborators on this project were the well-known liturgists Jungmann, Unel, Guy, Vagaggini, Galeno, Boyer, and McManus. Okay, read on. Monsignor Johannes Wagner, who was
director of the Liturgical Institute of Trier. Writing in 1959, he explained that the Holy Week reforms were the forerunner of the reform of the Mass itself. Quote, "It has always been the desire of those working for a true renewal of the liturgy that it should, in its whole action, become meaningful again. A meaningful interplay, or better, combined action and interaction of many, where each has his own non-interchangeable, non-transferable contribution to make, his own part to play. The new order of Holy Week shows many tendencies to this direction. This reform would indeed be the beginning of the great renewal of the liturgy, which the Church needs. God grant it." End quote.
footnote Johannes Wagner, prescriptive. All right.
Leaving aside the inbuilt presumption of divine approval, which has always been a characteristic of the Reformers, we cannot ignore the fact that Monsignor Wagner had some personal involvement in the liturgical movement industry. The institute he directed was responsible for publishing militant propaganda in favor of the Holy Week reforms and for organizing congresses in Germany and abroad for the same purpose. In 1950, the institute organized the first German liturgical congress at Frankfurt. In 1951, the first international congress, in 1951, the first international congress of liturgical studies at Maria Laach. And in 1955, the second German liturgical congress at Munich. All put pressure on Pius XII for liturgical reforms, some of which were granted in his pontificate, the rest being only a matter of time before they materialized.
Where angels fear to tread. A far-sighted and apt quotation from Alexander Pope's Essay on Criticism, written 1709, says, "No place so sacred from such fops is barred, nor is Paul's church more safe than Paul's churchyard. Nay, fly to altars, there they'll talk you dead, for fools rush in where angels fear to tread." In his reference to Paul's church, Alexander Pope was referring to Old St. Paul's Cathedral in London, before it was burned down in 1666 and replaced by the present cathedral. In the reigns of James I and Charles I, the central aisle, properly known as St. Paul's Walk, was the common resort of politicians, newsmongers, and idle people in general, all disseminating their views and gossip at great length. Although that custom was no longer extant in Alexander Pope's time, he used it as a metaphor for ideological ranting. Back to the text. As we have seen, these congresses called for, among other things, the elimination of much of the Roman Rite, the use of the
vernacular
and active
participation by the people.
Yeah, active participation was always their big buzzword. The reformers rushed in where angels fear to tread by proposing to change what?
The canon of the Mass.
Yeah, that was unthinkable, to touch the canon of the Mass. For centuries, priests, bishops, they all knew it's a mortal sin to change the canon. It is evident that the reformers who patronized the congresses simply used the gatherings as the proverbial fishing expeditions to trawl for any information, however biased or spurious, they could later use as false evidence for the need to dismantle the Church's ancient liturgy. In order to assess the extent of the damage done by Bonini's men to the Holy Week ceremonies, of the ancient Roman Rite. All we need is a pre-1955 missal in one hand and a 1962 missal which contains the bulk of Pius XII's reforms in the other. A simple comparison will reveal the depredations of a progressivist culture, twisting its knives deep into the entrails of the Church's traditions. It will also serve to remind us that lynchchi was not the sole preserve of the Chinese. In other words, what? They applied this torture to
The church.
the Church's sacred liturgy, to Holy Week, to the Mass, sacraments. Just slowly slice, cut, penetrate, turn, and cut the guts. The blessing of palms on Palm Sunday, Anthony.
The first thing we notice in Pius XII's reform, also in the 1962 Missal, is that the asperges, which preceded every solemn Sunday celebration throughout the year, has been dropped.
Footnote, except in Eastertide, when it is replaced by another equally solemn ceremony, the Vidiaquam. So, in the 62 Reform, they dropped the asperges.
Well, that's another one that the society.
Yeah, Archbishop Lefebvre kept the asperges. So you see, he didn't obey the 62 strictly. Because all the 62 lovers now, they're all violently defending. Archbishop Lefebvre stayed with 62, so you have to accept it. And Pius XII approved it, so you have to accept it. Well, obviously, Archbishop Lefebvre didn't accept everything. He kept the second Confiteor, he kept the asperges for the high-end solemn masses, and I'm sure he kept a lot more. Go on.
Regrettable though that may be, the significance of its loss hardly registers on the scale of destruction wrought on the ancient and venerable rite of the blessing of palms which preceded the Mass. It is important to know that the rite of blessing and the Mass together formed a monolithic structure which had remained solid and unchanged for many centuries. As such, it was indivisible, an organized whole that exerted a powerful and influential force for spiritual good in the Church. The destruction of the rite of blessing can be described, without exaggeration, as a total cliff-face collapse of the traditional structure, as it was simply scooped out by the reformers. In the resulting landslide, as we shall see, many beautiful prayers and accompanying ceremonial, valued over the centuries for their power to move the soul and reinforce the faith, were swept away.
How important was the traditional blessing of palms? Gabriel?
Dom Prosper Garanger remarked with reference to this ceremony, quote, "We may have an idea of its importance by the solemnity used by the Church in this sacred rite," end quote. No greater token of its importance could be given than to enshrine the blessing of palms in a rite that is closely modeled on that of the Mass itself. The pre-55 rite began at the altar, on which the palms were laid. The sequence of texts corresponded to the introit, collect, epistle, gradual, gospel, secret, preface, sanctus, and post-communion. The part of the rite corresponding to the canon was filled with seven prayers of blessing of the palms, after which the clergy and the people would approach the altar, as they would at communion time, to receive the blessed palms. This structure, with its obvious connection to the Holy Sacrifice, was abandoned by the 1955 decree, thus turning the traditional rite overnight into a museum piece. Now let us examine why our forefathers in the faith considered these Palm Sunday ceremonies of such great importance, and, by implication, why the 1955 reformers, who abolished them, did not. Even the briefest survey of its prayers and ceremonies, which is all that can be attempted here, would suffice to show that they were valued for their theological content, their poetic beauty, their expressive symbolism, and their ability to move the soul to enter, through contemplation into the mystery of Christ's passion. Their effect was enhanced when they were conducted against the backdrop of imposing architecture, magnificent vestments, and the sublime strains of Gregorian chant. All these elements combine to attract and edify both clergy and faithful for many centuries.
Theological content suppressed. The first casualty of the reform of the blessing of palms was the essential connection between the passion of Christ and the institution of the Holy Eucharist. First point, before 1956, the text of the liturgy gave an overview of salvation history, starting with the events of the Old Testament, when the Israelites murmured against Moses and Aaron, and God provided them with manna in the desert. They related Christ's entry into Jerusalem as a figure of his triumph through his passion over sin and death. The obvious analogy with the Eucharist is that God provides the bread of life on our altars through the holy sacrifice. Next point, in the traditional rite, the Gospel of the Palm Sunday Mass, which is taken from the Passion according to
St. Matthew.
Passio Domini nostri Iesu Christi, secundum Matteo. So St. Matthew's Gospel included the institution of the Holy Eucharist. So we did this just Palm Sunday. And it's longer than the 62 versions because it includes the Last Supper event. But this was cut out in what year?
1956.
As it was in all the Passion readings of the Reformed Holy Week. So why would they cut out the union of the Last Supper with Calvary?
Because they don't want you to look at the Mass as a sacrifice.
Exactly. They divorced it. You're right. Next point, to sever any visible connection with the Eucharist, the blessing of palms was no longer to be performed at the altar, but on a table separated from it. And besides, where does the priest stand in reference to the table often?
He stands facing the people.
Facing the people. Get the people used to seeing the priest in front of them with a table in front of him, facing them. Secondly, Pius XII's reform abolished the preface. Footnote, part of the preface of the Blessing of Palms reads, For thee do thy creatures serve because they know thee, their only author and God, and all the things that thou hast made join in praising thee. And thy saints bless thee, and that they confess with unfaltering voice before kings and powers of this world that great name, the name of thine only begotten Son. Close quote. So as you remember, how many prefaces were there on Palm Sunday Mass?
There were two.
One for the blessing of the palms and one for
the actual Mass.
So the preface was abolished, which proclaimed Christ's authority over all the kings and powers of this world. So that's another point modernists cannot stomach, is Christ's kingship. They hate it. They can't stomach it. They war against it. So we'll pick up there next time. Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.